Thank you for having me tonight to talk to the topic of a growing cruelty of our asylum seeker policy. And I guess I would like to start by saying we really need look no further than the invasion and brutal, violent colonial occupation of Australia to see that our propensity for cruelty really goes back to the invasion of this land by an imperial force. So when I saw the topic was the growing cruelty, I guess I wanted to be very upfront and just say, I think it's been cruel all along and it's evolved. I think it's more overtly fascist and authoritarian and lacking in humanity in recent years. But the discrimination and the racism and the violence and the militarization has been present now in our refugee policy, going back to the Howard era, of course, the children overboard, the Tampa. And then we had the ALP reopen Manus Island and very smoothly move itself to the right and into lockstep with the Liberal Party and the coalition on the issue of refugees. So rather than growing in cruelty, I think it's grown in bipartisan commitment to cruelty and commitment to abuse of human rights. I think it's quite telling that we are the only Commonwealth nation that does not have a treaty with the First Nations people of the land. And we are also the only Commonwealth country that doesn't have a Bill of Rights. So we live in a land that is built on cruelty, that is built on the blood, sweat and tears of the First Nations people. And we have progressively implemented through both sides of politics a refugee policy that really is a continuation of the White Australia policy without declaring it as such. So the people that are trapped on Manus Island and Nauru and Christmas Island, as far as I'm concerned, they are all political hostages. They are being held and used to win elections and to further cement an Australian national identity that could only be described as bordering on neo-fascism or fascism in its treatment of those that are othered in our community. So I think that what is going on in Australia is something that has come to a crisis point, obviously, because of the physical and the emotional harm that is being caused. And I think that the question we should be asking is, how do we stop this? How do we end the madness of this policy? And where does this come from? That we live in a country where this is considered acceptable, where it's considered reasonable and necessary to protect our borders in this militarized way. So for me, one of the important things in my experience of advocating and protesting and organising around refugee rights, and in particularly around ending the offshore detention of human beings and also ending the corporatisation and the privatisation of the detention industry, led me to reflect on who is it that profits from these processes and who is going to profit in the future from these processes. And there seems to be a clear connection between the militarisation of what should basically be a humanitarian response to a global crisis of displaced people due to decades of our participation in US empires, wars of aggression, and increased militarisation and interoperability that we have engaged in with the US empire in its pursuit of resources. So there are these things that are coming together that are militarisation, permanent warfare, and climate change. And the kind of refugee numbers that we are seeing now are a drop in the ocean to what is going to come probably via ocean with climate change, crop failure, of sea level rises, of salinity, and all the things that create civic unrest in countries around climate. And that the biggest user of fossil fuels on the planet is, of course, the US military and its partners. So we seem to have this one-stop shop going on where the same people that profit out of making weapons, the people that profit out of extracting resources through violent, militarized neo-colonial behavior, and then their corporate partners are the ones that profit out of the detention industry and the detention of those human beings. And it is the people in positions of political power, of course, that not only profit from concentrating their power within the political system, but they're often assured places on boards and in corporations as soon as they leave. You know, a really great example of that is Kim Beazley sits on Lockheed Martin's board now. So, you know, he went out of being an ambassador to the US to sitting on the biggest arms manufacturer in the world on their board. So there is a revolving door, and these things are not by coincidence interrelated, because these are the oppressions that are used in our society to ensure that a privileged group of people hold a position of power, and that requires the oppression of the population and the planet and the resources. So I think we really need to start looking at what is actually going on offshore detention. If these people are being used as deterrents, as political footballs or hostages to ensure that no one else comes, we have to ask ourselves what has happened in Australia. Have we always been like this, or did we just get to this point? Is it growing, or has it always been this way? It's just now the mask is torn off, and these politicians feel that they can act in an increasingly authoritarian and fascist way towards those people they deem as undesirable. And to understand that, we need to go back to the First Nations, and we need to recognise that the country is built on racist structures, colonialism, denial of a history of how we came to be, and a failure to recognise that when you build a country on violence and lies and oppression, you forever distort the very heart of that culture. Because to maintain that story, that mythology, we have to have this vigilance against anyone that would come to do that to us. So Kathy has asked me before around, you know, what do I think some of the drivers are in the psyche of the Australian population? And I really think that the fear of boats is almost as good a metaphor as war on terror for the Australian government, because politicians know that the history of the First Nations people has been denied, that it's not taught in schools, that we don't understand the frontier wars. And it's only been because of First Nations activists and organisers that the community is beginning to understand the insult of Australia Day, which is really Invasion Day, or the fact that a whole history of warfare and attempted genocide that took place in this country cannot be spoken about, cannot be acknowledged. So it's very easy to manipulate a population through fear politics by saying boats are going to come, we're going to be invaded. And immediately the psyche of the nation senses that maybe they'll do what the last lot of people did, which is us, right? So yeah, I think there are a lot of truths that need to be acknowledged before we can even get to a point of understanding what has enabled Australia to allow our politicians to participate in the murder and the rape and the torture and the child abuse of those that came seeking asylum. It's not illegal to seek asylum by boat. These people have human rights that we have systematically denied and harmed. We are complicit in what our government puts forward as a policy and a treatment of human beings. And we need to acknowledge that both sides of politics in this country have absolutely participated in harming human beings, not just one person, but the children of that person, Everybody knows now there has been an enormous amount of study done on intergenerational trauma and PTSD. You're basically ensuring an entire group of people will never be able to have a normal life again. And not only that, but the people that have to implement that policy will surely be traumatized for the rest of their lives when in those very quiet moments in their own homes, they have to acknowledge that they actually facilitated and participated in the torture of refugees, in the indefinite detention of refugees, in the mental health deterioration of children. These are things that you would think would be unacceptable in a country like Australia. And yet, time and time again, we vote in politicians who will ensure the abuse of human rights and physical rights of these people. So when I think about where we're at, I don't think of it as a growing culture of cruelty. I think of it as a country that has been built on violence and lies. I think of it as a country that has never been able to acknowledge its foundation of racism, of colonialism, of extractivism, and of sexism. And the violence committed both in this country to the First Nations people and to women and to minorities and those that are othered, of course, it's quite clear that they would be able to get away with putting people on an island far away. I guess the only thing that I have hope in is that there has always been resistance. And one of the reasons that they chose to put people on islands is because when they held those people at Woomera and Baxter, people left their jobs and drove out there to tear the fences down and to help those people get out of there. So the only thing that the Australian government could do to get away with this was to actually move these people so far away that organisers and advocates and just anyone with a beating heart couldn't get close to those people. We've seen an increasing crackdown on advocates and refugee supporters. It's now incredibly difficult to go and visit. You have to go through layers and layers of applications and notification to get in. One person in our group was sent a letter from Border Force stating very clearly, you are not allowed to visit because of your political activity against Border Force. We're seeing all sorts of surveillance going on for activists. Only 2 days ago, another member of our group was stopped by Border Force entering the country and had their phone confiscated and downloaded, we guess, before it was returned. And they were told under the new laws they had to give their password or they'd be committing offence. So I think that there is an absolute determination by both sides of politics to continue the offshore process. And we need to ask ourselves why. And I think part of the reason why is that there is a very large sector of our society that is extremely racist because we've been inculcated generation after generation into a structure that is designed to be not only racist, but sexist and classist. And while the mythology about Australia may talk about boundless plains to share and mateship and egalitarianism, the reality of this penal colony that invaded and almost wiped out the Indigenous population is very different to the mythology that we tell ourselves and that we tell the world about who we are. And the first step to permanently ensuring that this never happens again, because it will be a very dark stain on our history down the track. They'll look back and say, how could they lock children up on islands for their whole life just because they existed? What crime had they committed? No crime. But what do you mean they locked them up for their whole lives until they set themselves on fire? This is what we're creating. This is not just about a policy implemented by one side of politics in this country. This is about a nation that refuses to acknowledge its entitlement and its behaviour. This is about a nation that is now being promoted across the world as the blueprint for fascist response to refugees. we should be very concerned about that, because once they've done with the refugees, they'll come for somebody else. Probably people like me, followed perhaps by whistleblowing doctors, analysts, which they've already done in the past. You know, in fact, Chelsea Manning was just denied a visa. Why? You know, and yet Nigel Farage will be speaking in Melbourne on Friday night. They invite in people to this country that spout racism and sexism and misogyny and white power and white supremacy. They want to bring in South African farmers because they're white. They want to ban all brown people from being able to immigrate or seek asylum. And yet they go on mainstream media and say they're not racist and that this is not about the color of someone's skin. I think we need to really look at what's going on. And I think we need to understand that it will not change by signing petitions or even by lobbying the Liberal Party or the ALP. The ALP is stuck to this policy. They have supported deportations and boat turnbacks. They said they will continue offshore detention. They make no mention of closing the camps and evacuating those people that are deteriorating by the day. Every day there is another day in hell. And I'm sure the doctor speaking tonight can speak in great detail to what's been witnessed and how that must just go against every ethic that every doctor has, to have to participate in that and not be able to help a human being who is suffering that much that they want to kill themselves. Meanwhile, in Australia, we run ads telling people to call depression lines and to prevent suicide, to look out for your mates. I wonder if the people on Manus Island and Christmas Island and Nauru, if they were white, would we be raging in the streets? Would we be shutting down the parliament? What would we do? What would the country do if they were white people being held there? It's a question we should be asking ourselves. And I think that if we're very honest, we all know the response would be extremely different. So we have a much bigger issue than just one policy. We have a cultural issue, and we have a psychic problem in this country because we won't acknowledge what happened when we came here as a colony, a colonizer. We won't acknowledge what we've already done. Every child in detention in the Northern Territory is Aboriginal. We should be out on the streets. How is that possible? We must start looking at this holistically. We must understand that the war economy and the search for resources and the fossil fuel industry and the detention industry, they all function on the basis of maintaining privilege and power at the oppression of other people and the planet. They all carry a particular signature around who should be privileged, who gets blown up, who gets to be free. I'm sure you've all seen the memes going around about au pairs this week with Peter Dutton. And I think it's a very serious issue because it does point to the repeated public behaviour and ideology that is totally prepared to openly, in Australia in 2018, privilege white people entering this country over brown people. So I think that for those people that are interested in ending offshore detention and the torture and abuse that is taking place through our detention industry, both offshore and onshore, for refugees, we need to understand that public policy and politics has failed us for over a decade now. So we need to mix up what we're doing to end this madness. And I think we need to start by acknowledging that no one should have to be complicit in a policy or in implementing a policy that actually removes and abuses the human rights of a child or an adult. That should be the fundamental bottom line. No public servant should have to participate in any process related to Manus Island or Nauru anymore. They should not have to be assigned to that. They should not have to stamp the denial of transport to a hospital. They should not be implementing a policy that is not only fascist but abusive on a level that, you know, this country couldn't have imagined 20 years ago. So I would really like to see people recognising that the only way we're going to change this policy is if we get a whole lot more interventionist and disruptive around this issue. We need to stop them from being able to implement this policy easily, and we need to get people off those islands. And to do that, we're going to need everyone to refuse to be complicit. And I think key to that is public servants need to recognise that they have rights and that they should not have to participate in a policy that one day may be quoted in the International Criminal Court for the behaviour and the participation of Border Force officials in the murder, rape, torture and child abuse of refugees. So I would ask anyone who works in the public servant or that has anything to do with the entire corporatised supply chain, Serco, Wilson Security, G4S, Transfield, Broad Spectrum, Palantir, like the list goes on and on. Anyone working in those fields needs to start saying no to taking those contracts, to doing those jobs. Public servants could ask to be transferred, they could blow the whistle, they could leak documents, they could bring this to an end very quickly. And I think the one thing from a grassroots activist point of view that has been fairly missing in action on really pushing to end this is the union movement. And they have people that work, that are union members through the CPSU, that work for the public servant. And these people are having to implement policies. Many of them feel much like I do, and maybe many of you do, that it's unacceptable, it's inhumane, it must make them feel sick. You know, I'm sure some of them have quit, and I'm sure some of them are suffering terribly in silence and gritting their teeth and hoping we kick this government out and the ALP come to their senses once they're in power. But the reality is that every day that we wait to evacuate those people, there's the potentiality that someone else may die or kill themselves. And we all need to live with that knowledge. And if we don't step forward and try and stop this, then we have to accept the fact that we are complicit in what has taken place in this particular point in time in history. And sometimes to make the kind of social change required to make a policy unacceptable, people need to be prepared to risk something. And if you want to compare this to the 1930s in Germany, many people risked a lot to try and fight the rise of this kind of fascism. We are already implementing things in this country that America is only now just getting to and thinking about. I found it extraordinary to watch the number of Australians online who were outraged that Trump was separating families. I was also outraged. My partner is from Mexico, so it had particular importance to me to watch small children being separated and taken back across the border, etc. But you know what? We're already doing that. We've been doing it for years. We've not only been separating families, we've been blackmailing them. We've been telling them the only way that they can be together is if the father that was brought for medical treatment agrees to go back to Nauru or signs a document to give up the rights to his child. We've been doing these kind of things for years in Australia. We are everything that America is only just getting to when it comes to refugees. We are the blueprint for the fascist response to a humanitarian crisis that has been built on the back of invading countries to steal their resources, to take their land, and to change their ideologies for geopolitical domination. And in the process, we have exacerbated climate change. We have displaced millions of people and killed millions more. And then when they come to us seeking help, we criminalise that act with no basis in law, and we lock them up political islands. and pretend that they're not our responsibility, while our tax dollars pay for everything that is done to those human beings. So it's up to us. We can't rely on the politicians, and we certainly can't rely on the corporations to stop taking contracts to torture people and lock them up. So that requires the community and the people, the good people with heart and soul that are in the system, to actually rebel. And this is not just sign a petition or tell a friend about it. We are at the point where people need to strike, refuse to comply, don't get involved. Call your politician, not once every month, 3 times a day. Ask him what he's done about it now. What have you done about it now? Oh, how about now? We have to make ourselves so disruptive to the psyche of the entities that believe they can get away with this kind of behaviour, that they realise they can't implement the policy any further. And that requires us boycotting the corporations that are profiteering off the misery of refugees. It requires us acknowledging that part of the reason that we have this refugee policy is because we entered into 2 illegal wars, the war on terror, and this has exacerbated everything, not just displacing people, but exacerbating climate change, particularly in Syria. And I believe that those that are in positions of power, as has been stated by white defence papers in Australia and in America and in Europe, they understand very well that the recklessness that they have treated this planet and its human family with over the last 50, 60 years of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, is about to come crashing down on them to the point where there will be millions of people internally displaced because of climate change. And they are putting up the walls. They are putting up the borders. They are deciding who is privileged enough to continue to thrive in the future world that has been wrecked by their addiction to fossil fuels. So we need to understand that the refugee policy that Australia has blueprinted to the rest of the world is not only one that is inhumane, illegal, fascist, it's also one that is strategically created to ensure that as we move into more and more extreme weather events from climate change and changing environments, that certain groups of people are protected and other groups are left to fend for themselves. And that's a very bleak thing to consider, I understand, but I think it is really the reality. If you look at all of the defence papers, everything points to climate change being the biggest disruptor. These people, like the Australian government, like a lot of European governments, obviously like America, at the moment they are using fear politics and the concept of othering of Muslims and the war on terror and terrorism. But this is really to establish a system of cruelty that will be able to stop people from entering countries when they no longer are able to survive in their own worlds. And we only need to look at Bangladesh to know what kind of disaster could be potentially being faced by an entire population. So to wrap up, I want to say I think the most productive thing that we can do at this point is to treat this with the absolute seriousness that it deserves, that every day those camps remain open and those people are not evacuated and brought to safety to be processed, hopefully sent to New Zealand. I wouldn't want to live in Australia after I'd been tortured by our government. But to bring them to safety and process them, that should be the absolute combined effort of not only the refugee movement, but any other social or environmental activist that understands why they're using this policy and why they're setting this up this way for future. So I'd like to see the entire social movement push in the same direction to refuse to be complicit and disrupt this process. Our politicians won't do it, we will have to do it. Thank you for listening.